I'm thankful that I get a right of reply, Christopher. I would prefer the term a Dutch paradox. Indeed, it's good to be with you here this afternoon. And I look forward to talking with you about the battle of religious freedom. And when we talk about religious freedom, we often lament for a kinder, gentler past, a time when religion was respected in society. Now, in her short stories, the great Catholic writer Flannery O'Connor observes the American South in the 1960s. I was reading a story of hers called Greenleaf, in which a farming widow, Mrs. May, comes across her employee, Mrs. Greenleaf, praying in the woods and saying out loud, "Jesus!" And this quote struck me. Mrs. May winced. She thought the word Jesus should be kept inside the church building, like other words inside the bedroom. She was a good Christian woman with a large respect for religion, though she did not, of course, believe any of it was true. So you see, the cultural seeds that O'Connor observed 60 years ago in America are now in full bloom in Australian society. In Australian society, Jesus is increasingly being kept inside the church building. More and more Christians are being excluded from the public square, and while Australians profess a tolerance for Christianity, they certainly don't want you talking about it. And that's borne out by the research. A recent ABC Australia Talks national survey asked people a number of cultural questions, and 71% of Australians, represented by those green numbers there, say that religious discrimination happens either occasionally or often. So Australians recognise that Christians get a raw deal. Yet most of those same people, 60% of them, said they would prefer it if you kept your religious views to yourself. Keep it in the church, keep it in your head. We see an interesting snapshot of what's happening in Australian society in the story of this man, a Wallaby, a Pacific Islander, a Christian who is not Israel Folau, but in fact, Sekope Kepu. Does anyone know Sekope Kepu? Very good. The Australian newspaper just this week published a copy of his affidavit that was filed in support of Israel Folau. Now, he talks about the reaction from within the team, from within the rugby team, of the fallout from Israel Folau's tweet. He says, "A lot of the boys of faith, that is, those I knew to be Christian, told me that they were disappointed. In fact, he'd scrubbed out some other word and replaced it with disappointed in his affidavit. Disappointed by how the situation was handled and what other players were saying in the media. I felt the same," he says. So he took his concerns to the New South Wales coach, to the captain of both New South Wales and the Wallabies, to the coach of the Wallabies, and to Raylene Castle, the CEO of Rugby Australia. He was taken off media duties, and this is what his perception of what was happening is. "My perception was that management did not want me speaking to the media because I might speak my mind on the Israel Folau case. My perception was that the media was briefed to approach people who would toe the anti-Israel line and were discouraged from approaching anyone who was a potential Israel supporter, including the Christian players." Now, this is where it gets interesting because these things have consequences. He says, "Israel was important to me as a Christian member of the teams. After Israel moved to rugby in 2013, he helped me feel more confident in expressing my religion in front of the playing groups." And here's the sad bit. Israel also started team prayer groups the night before each game. Any player could join if they wanted, Since Israel has been gone, the prayer groups have stopped. Kepu gives a revealing insight into what I see in my work daily. I'm the principal lawyer of the Human Rights Law Alliance, Australia's only religious freedom law firm. We're an independent sister organisation of the ACL, and we exist to help Christians facing legal threats to try to exclude them from the public square. If you see our table outside, we have plenty of resources to tell you what we do, and especially good is a brochure that lists many of the religious freedom cases where Christians are facing threats and discrimination and hostility in Australian society. Please pick a copy up. So, the atmosphere that Kepu describes is common in our workplaces, in our schools, in our hospitals, and in the public service. We see a punching down from the top to the little guy. Religious voices are silenced. Keep it in the church. We see hostile voices are encouraged. They are supported and they are celebrated. And any Christian expression, like prayer groups, are then, as a consequence, silenced. There's a complete chilling effect. The name of Jesus is okay, but keep it in the church. So this provides a good segue into the Religious Discrimination Bill. The Morrison government has introduced a Religious Discrimination Bill, and its stated aims are these. Number one, to outlaw discrimination against religion in public life. And number two, to enhance the legal protections of the right of freedom of religion in Australia. Now, a statement I think we could all get behind is this one that says, all Australians, regardless of their religious belief or activity, should be able to participate fully in our society. That sounds reasonable. Doesn't that sound reasonable? Not according to Equality Australia. Just prior to Christmas, Equality Australia released an attack ad featuring such human rights notables as Ian Thorpe the swimmer and Lauren Jackson the basketballer and others. The message was severe. A bill is being drafted that threatens to divide our community. The Religious Discrimination Bill will give people the right to discriminate. It will divide our communities. It will take us backwards. It will affect us all. And as a Christian, you hear that and you go, wait a minute. Take us backwards? I don't want to do that. Does anyone here want to take us backwards? Does anyone here want to divide Australian community? So it's worth looking at what is actually in this Religious Discrimination Bill and testing it to see whether A, it adequately protects us as Christians, and B, whether any of the scaremongering we're seeing in the media is actually true. So let's look firstly at what is the engine room of the Religious Discrimination Bill. Those core provisions that are in the bill protecting against religious discrimination. These provisions are completely vanilla and unremarkable and are largely a cut and paste of existing protections that are given to other rights such as sex, age, pregnancy status, sexuality and gender. It follows exactly the same format, and there are 4 basic steps to establish religious discrimination. Step 1, you must establish that you have the protected attribute. In this case, religious belief or activity. The Religious Discrimination Bill doesn't define these terms, but makes clear in the explanatory notes that it will encompass a wide range of religious beliefs and the widest ranges of expression of that in religious activity. Not just what you do in church, not just what you believe in your head, but the expression of that in your life. The activity is expansive. It expressly includes evangelism. So it's very broad to come under the protection of step 1. Step 2, you need to establish that you've experienced less favourable treatment. And here there are 2 branches you can go down. You can either say, I've been directly discriminated against. They said, John, you are a Christian, and because of that, we are not going to give you this job. That's direct discrimination. Doesn't happen very often, very difficult to prove. The second limb is indirect discrimination, where a rule has been put in place or a condition that seems to be neutral in its effect. In this job, you must not wear any head coverings, but which will unfairly treat one religious group in comparison to those of other religious convictions or no religious conviction. So you need to establish in step 2 that you've had that less favourable treatment. The other hurdle you must have is that you must show that the treatment or the condition that is imposed is not reasonable. In fact, the law requires the person who imposes the condition, if they think it's reasonable, to say, well, actually I did impose that condition, but it's okay for me to suppress religious freedom because what I'm doing is reasonable. And that is going to be a very, very contentious issue in all cases. How reasonable is it? What is the bar that you have to reach before you can stamp on someone's religious freedom? This is a question that we're advocating on fiercely, and I'll talk about that a little bit later. But that's not the last step. Step 3 is that you have to come within a category of unlawful treatment. So it's got to be in some public activity such as work, education, accommodation, provision of goods and services, sports and clubs. If you discriminate in these circumstances, then it is unlawful. And the last thing you have to do is make sure, step 4, that the discrimination does not fall within an exception. An example being, you're not allowed to discriminate in employment, but if you are hiring someone personally to perform domestic duties, then you have complete freedom to hire who you want of whichever religious conviction or persuasion that you want. So that's just a really brief outline of what is a fairly complex system, but again, the engine room of this act is pretty vanilla and non-controversial. Are you still with me? Are you awake? Very good. Let's do a case study. This is Byron and Kira Hordyke, a lovely family from Western Australia. Some of you might have seen their story on the latest episode of The Truth of It with Martin Iles and some media coverage that's gone along with it. Byron and Kira have 3 children of their own. They had it on their hearts that they wanted to participate in the fostering of children. They made an application to a fostering agency. When they expressed their orthodox views on sexuality and gender as part of that process, their application form was ripped up and they were told, sorry, you are unsafe to foster children. They pointed out that they had only applied to foster children between the ages of 0 and 5, and that only as temporary respite carers for respite from full-time care, a situation in which you think LGBTQ issues couldn't sensibly arise or be a real risk. Byron and Kira are currently taking an action in the Western Australian jurisdiction where religious freedom has some coverage. If we get a Religious Discrimination Act, they would also have had the option of going under that. This new religious discrimination bill that's going through Parliament has easier steps to go through. The way in WA is difficult and requires a lot of evidence. We are going to have to brief up to 6 experts to give particular evidence and 9 key elements to prove discrimination in a trial that could be up to 14 days. Under this RDB, the Religious Discrimination Bill, the pathway is easier and the steps are clearer without changing the essential test or shifting the balance one way or the other. In practical terms, it would be of benefit to Byron and Kira. Let's look at some other notable features of the Religious Discrimination Bill. Also, these are features that have been getting a lot of attention, maybe most of the attention in the media. The first positive thing we see in this Religious Discrimination Bill is that it is recognised expressly that these rights of religious freedom have equal status in international law with all other rights and freedoms. This will be the first time that that is expressly stated in an Australian statute. Secondly, we have the Falau Clause, which is the first time we have a clause in a bill that will seek to protect the mere expression of your opinion and of speech. It's a protection against big employers silencing the religious employees in their personal time. We also have the Porteous Clause, and this is the clause that will deal with the situation of Archbishop Julian Porteous, who was silenced or taken to a discrimination court in Tasmania because he had the temerity to try to teach Catholic doctrine as a Catholic clergyman to Catholic people in a Catholic school about marriage. So the bill has a clause that protects statements of faith, statements of belief from discrimination claims. Doesn't mean you can say what you want all the time. It just means that if you were to express what you believe, you can't be dumped on by activists and targeted with litigation for discrimination. Of course, not all statements are covered. It must arise reasonably out of your Christian doctrine or religious doctrine. It must be made in good faith, and it must not be likely to harass, threaten, seriously intimidate or vilify. So it is not a carte blanche. We also have protection for religious bodies and religious organisations, and a recognition that Christians band together and make organisations that must be able to teach in accordance with their beliefs, hire in accordance with their beliefs, and operate in accordance with their beliefs. There's also some limited protection for those who conscientiously object in the medical profession. And it says that a regulator in the medical field cannot impose a rule on conscientious objectors that goes beyond state or territory law, unless it would have an impact on health. Note that conscientious objection protection is very limited. It's only relating to the provision of certain kinds of service. It must reasonably arise out of the doctrines and tenets of your religion, and it can't be used to target specific groups of people. So let's look a little bit closer at the Falau Clause. The Falau Clause protects statements of belief. Again, these must be made in good faith. They must be made without vilifying, harassing. The Falau Clause protects statements of belief from an employer conduct rule, where an employer makes a rule that says you can or cannot say certain things outside of the workplace. But it's only employer conduct rules made by relevant employers, that is, employers who are not the government, this does not bind the government, and employers who have revenue of over $50 million. So this is only the large end of town which is not allowed to, or has an express rule that says you can't tell your employees what to do outside of work. The only time they can, so it's only for statements outside of the workplace, and the only time they can impose restrictions on your speech outside of work is if they can show it would cause unjustifiable financial hardship to their business. The great thing about this Falau Clause is even though the scope is narrow and it's modest in who it covers, the current draft of the Religious Discrimination Bill also extends the same protections to professionals who are under a regulatory body and prevents those regulators from making rules that restrict the behaviour and restrict the statements of the professionals who they administer. Do you think this is a problem in Australia? It is. Let me give you another case study of Dr. Melissa, who is again on our australiawatch.com.au website, which catalogues all of these religious freedom cases. Dr. Melissa has been a GP for 15 years, has never had a complaint from a client, from a patient, or from another doctor. However, Dr. Melissa has been very, very active on social media, talking about a lot of conservative political causes, as well as Christian issues around sexuality, gender, life, euthanasia. An activist, anonymously, made a complaint to the medical board. This was not a patient. This was not someone who knew the doctor, but had seen their posts on the internet and was incensed. The medical board went through an investigation process, and this was no ordinary investigation. They employed a firm to do a complete audit of everything this doctor had done on the internet for the last 15, 20 years, gave the doctor 2,000 pages of their internet history, said it's already been looked at by the medical board, who next Friday, 7 days away, is going to remove your registration as a doctor using emergency powers. And I said, well, can I clarify that this is only for social media posts that you would stop someone from being a doctor? They said, yes, it is. We think this doctor is a danger to the public. Included in that material was an article written in a Christian newspaper about the scientific facts about transgender. It was some posts about same-sex marriage, was posts about the fact that removing perfectly healthy body organs is mutilation. Not only was it felt that this doctor, Dr. Melissa, was dangerous, it was also stated that she was bringing the rest of the profession into disrepute by contradicting existing medical practice guidelines for transgender and for sexuality. The good thing about this religious discrimination bill is that it will now give this doctor a lever to get protection for personal statements made outside of the working environment. Because in the existing health practitioner social media code of conduct, they're already putting in place restrictions. Listen to this. You are told you could get in trouble if you say something insensitive like this. Abstinence is the best way to avoid HIV. Not sure why we are investing public dollars into developing vaccines. Just do what the Bible tells us to do. Now, I think you should be able to say that, even if I may not agree with all of it, some of it, none of it. Increasingly, doctors are being coerced into silence, their voices are being excluded from that public square. So, let's move on. I was going to talk about religious bodies, but I don't think I have time. The areas where we are advocating on this for Christians are on the standard of reasonableness for suppressing of religious freedom. Currently, we think the bill is not in line with international standards and international law, which requires a high bar. If you're going to trample on religious rights, it must be necessary. Secondly, I've gone back. Statements of belief. We want wider protections for statements of belief. Why should only people employed by large companies get that protection? It should be all people who make a mere, honest, reasonable statement of what they believe. We're looking to get religious bodies more comprehensive coverage, and we are also looking to ensure that religious schools are able to practice in accordance with their beliefs. Very important. This is work being done exceptionally by the team at ACL, by Dan Flynn, who's the Chief Political Officer. He's up and down from Canberra, from the Parliament Hill every day, meeting with people to advocate on these issues, and it's having results. Let's do some myth busting. You may have seen that there's been a voluminous amount of media about this, with voices left, right and centre saying this religious discrimination bill is bad. So let's start with Michael Kirby in the Sydney Morning Herald. He is a former Justice of our highest court, and he's said, under this legislation, a range of health professionals, including doctors, nurses and pharmacists, would be empowered to deny treatment to those who did not share their religious beliefs. Well, let's look at that. Number one, the bill does not allow denial of treatment. It merely says that rules made by your regulator can be challenged. Number two, if the law requires provision of that medical service, then you must provide it. Number three, It only relates to a kind of service, not the types of persons being served. Number 4, even if you are able to have a conscientious objection, if it will impact on the health services provided, then you're not given protection. And number 5, the explanatory notes say quite clearly, and in direct contradiction of our Chief Justice, you cannot decline to provide a particular health service to particular people or groups of people. So, this claim in the newspaper, false. Next, Paul Karp, in The Guardian's most read article of 2019, What You Can Say and Do Under the New Religious Discrimination Bill, says, a single mother, when dropping her child off at daycare, may be told by a worker that she is sinful for denying her child a father. Really? Which people amongst us are going to do this? Honestly, I don't know what these people think. Professor Neil Foster says, well, this is not actually discrimination right now. It's not illegal right now. And furthermore, it's not happening right now. No one is doing this. But it's just plain wrong. Statements of belief are only expressly protected outside of work. If you are in work, your boss is perfectly able, under existing law, to require you to be polite to the customers, to the clients. You must follow their reasonable and lawful directions, and if you don't, you will get warned, and then you will get fired. So this behaviour is not allowed under the bill, and the statement is false. Let's look at the Equality Australia ad, which says, it will take away your rights when people say offensive things such as, my waiter telling me that my relationship is an abomination in God's eyes. Again, who is doing this? And secondly, there is no express protection for these statements, and they're not illegal right now. It is not illegal to be rude like this. And thirdly, your employer, again, can impose on you reasonable and lawful directions such as, do not be rude to clients about their personal life. If you don't, you can be legitimately fired, and this bill will not help you. Again, false. What do we see from this? These campaigns are scaremongering. They're hypotheticals that never happened and won't happen. The media has shown more interest in the hypothetical cases that have never happened than the real cases that we've catalogued that have happened and which require protection. So, summary, key messaging about the bill. We consider this to be a valuable initiative. It's important for all Australians, not just for fringe conservatives. It will not achieve everything that we need to protect religious freedom, but it is a good start. It needs work. There are still fundamental flaws, and we're working on those. Don't believe the scaremongering hypotheticals. This is a modest step. Don't believe that this is some radical step that will drag us back into a past that we don't want to return to. This is modest. It provides religion with the same protections as other attributes that they already enjoy. Fourth, it's giving religious freedom equal protection. No one is getting privileged here. Fifth, improvement is needed, and that's where you come in. And I have a minute to talk to you about the take-home messaging and how you can be involved. The first thing you need to do is get informed. Watch the truth of it. Have a look at our Australia Watch website. Take some of our resources from the back and be informed of what's happening in religious freedom in Australia, how Christians are being excluded from the public square. Read some of the publicly available submissions on the bill and get into the detail. Number 2, be a voice, be unashamed. You need to contact your local federal MP, Labor, Liberal. Take some key messaging with you. Tell the real stories. Tell them that religious freedom needs protection. Tell them that it needs to be improved. Show that you're informed. Number 3, be vigilant. You're lucky I'm running out of time because I was going to have a crack at some clergy, but I won't, because they usually then have a crack at me from the pulpit tomorrow. Be vigilant. The price of freedom is constant vigilance. your issues might be different. Social justice, refugees, reaching the poor and the needy, that's okay, but you can't do any of that without religious freedom. It's the bedrock from which the freedom to do all those things comes from. And number 4, and I borrow this from my good friend Mark Sneddon, use your head, your heart, your hands. Your head is be informed. Your heart is to recognise that our battle is not against flesh and blood, but against the devil. That the people you engage with are not all activists, but are people often who are enslaved to the ideology of this world and who need compassion and should be dealt with that way. And hands. There are 2 ways to use your hands. Number 1, the best way is to pray. And the second is to take up your cross and follow Christ. And it may cost you something. I return to Flannery O'Connor to finish off, who said, "What people don't realise is how much religion costs. They think faith is a big electric blanket, when of course it is a cross." So let me encourage you to live your faith, to carry your cross, and to be unashamed. Thank you very much.